long before anyone felt the need to hurry. There was a world that moved slowly. This was a time before urgency had meaning, and before moments were measured too carefully. Days did not rush toward nights, and nights did not interrupt days. They simply followed one another. Calm and predictable, the land rested in a steady balance. Fields stretched outward without purpose, not trying to become anything more than fields. The soil held its shape quietly, untouched by ambition or demand, that there were no borders worth noticing, and no landmarks that asked to be remembered. Everything existed in its place, and remained there. The sky above this world was wide, and patient. It did not change quickly. Clouds drifted without intention, never racing to reach another edge of the horizon. Light arrived when it was time, and left when it was finished. There was no announcement, no signal, just a gentle transition from one state to another. In this world, there were paths, but they were not destinations. They existed simply because feet had passed there before, slowly and repeatedly, over many years. The ground remembered pressure more than purpose. No one asked where the path led, and no one expected it to lead anywhere important. Buildings were few and unremarkable. They were shaped by habit rather than design. Stone rested upon stone. Wood leaned against wood, not because it was beautiful, but because it worked. There was no decoration meant to impress, and no detail meant to stand out. Each structure blended into the land as if it had always been there. Inside these spaces, there was little to notice. A table stood where a table was needed. A chair waited without expecting anyone to sit. Light entered through small openings and rested on surfaces until it faded. Again, nothing inside asked for attention, and nothing demanded memory. Sound existed, but quietly. The wind moved when it needed to, and stopped when it did not. Fabric brushed gently against wood. Footsteps were soft and rare. Even silence felt full, not empty, as if the absence of noise was something solid and dependable. Time passed without being counted. There were no hours to mark, and no moments to miss. The day was simply the day, and the night was simply the night. There was comfort in not knowing exactly how much had passed, and no concern for how much was left. People existed in this world, but without urgency. They moved slowly, not because they were tired, but because there was no reason to move faster. Tasks repeated themselves in familiar ways, never changing enough to become interesting, and never stopping long enough to feel missed. Person might walk from one place to another without thinking of arrival. The movement itself was enough. The feeling of the ground beneath their feet, the steady rhythm of steps, these were not things to analyze. They simply happened. Nothing important happened here, not because something was missing, but because importance had not yet been invented. There were no events worth recording, and no stories worth telling. Every day resembled the last, and the next promised to do the same. This sameness was not dull to those who lived within it. It was simply how the world worked. There was safety in repetition, and ease in familiarity. When nothing changes, there is nothing to prepare for. As evening approached, it did so gently. Light softened rather than disappeared. Shadows lengthened without trauma. The air cooled slightly, and then remained still. No one rushed indoors, and no one stayed out too long. The transition was smooth, and unremarkable. Night arrived without ceremony. Darkness settled like a blanket that had always been there. Stars appeared quietly, not trying to be noticed. The world rested not because it was tired, but because rest was the natural next step, and so the world remained exactly as it had been. Before anything happened, before anything needed to happen. Before change had meaning. Asterisk morning returned in the same way it always had, without urgency and without announcement. Light slowly found its way across the land, resting gently on the ground before moving on again. Nothing reacted to its arrival because nothing needed to. The fields looked the same as they had the day before. Their shapes were unchanged, and their quiet presence filled the space without effort. The grass stood where it stood, and the earth held it without question. There was no growth worth observing and no decline worth noting. Things simply continued. Paths remained patient. They waited without expectation, allowing footsteps to pass when they passed, and remaining empty when they did not. The ground did not mind the difference. Both states were equally acceptable. Somewhere in the distance, a structure stood alone. It had stood there for longer than anyone could remember, and it would continue to stand without requiring attention. The walls were solid enough, and the roof was sufficient. There was no thought of improvement or expansion. There was no need. Inside this place, objects stayed where they had been placed. A cup rested on a surface. A cloth lay folded beside it. These items were not symbols of anything. They were simply present, and that was enough. People moved through these spaces slowly. They did not rush to complete tasks, because tasks would return regardless of speed. A slow movement and a fast movement produced the same result in the end, so the slower one felt more natural. There was a rhythm to these days, but it was not a strict one. It did not require precision. It allowed pauses. It allowed repetition without variation. No one listened closely to this rhythm, but everyone followed it without effort. Sounds came and went in small ways. A door might open and close. A footstep might cross a floor. These sounds did not interrupt the silence. They blended into it, becoming part of the steady background. Time continued without being marked. There were no signals to suggest that a moment had passed, and no reason to measure it. Every moment felt similar to the one before, and that sameness created a sense of calm. The air carried familiar scents that never changed enough to be noticed. They were present without drawing attention, and then they faded again. There was no curiosity about where they came from or where they went. Outside, the sky remained wide and unhurried. Clouds drifted slowly, changing shape without purpose. No one looked up expecting anything different. They had seen this before and would see it again. Movement across the land was minimal and deliberate. When someone walked, it was not toward something urgent. It was simply toward where they needed to be next, without thought of why. Nothing unexpected occurred. There were no interruptions to routine, and no moments that demanded reaction. The day unfolded exactly as it had before, and exactly as it would again. As afternoon approached, it did so gently. Light shifted slightly, and then settled again. The world adjusted without comment. Everything remained in balance. Eventually, Evening began to return. The change was gradual enough, and it went mostly unnoticed. Shadows lengthened once more, and the air cooled slightly. People paused where they were, and then continued. The pace did not change. There was no signal to stop or start. The day simply moved toward rest. Night followed in its usual way, quiet and steady. The darkness felt familiar and complete. The world prepared for nothing and rested for nothing. And once again, the world returned to stillness, unchanged and unconcerned, continuing as it always had before anything happened.